I'm always on the road and often pick up hitchhikers. My only rule: they have to share the scariest story they've ever heard, and now I'm going to retell it to you. Write in the comments what city you're listening from. I may have driven by it. That night, I woke up because I felt something touching my hair in my sleep. Even though I lived alone, I abruptly opened my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was silent. Maybe it was just another nightmare. I was about to close my eyes again and try to get some sleep when I suddenly heard a sob. It was a real sound, somewhere near me, as if someone was trying to stifle their crying. I listened to the silence, still not believing it, still hoping it was just my imagination, when I heard another sob, this time even closer. With my heart filled with terror, I quickly turned on the bed and then saw the reflection in the huge mirror I had bought a week ago. It was his reflection, the same man, only his figure seemed distorted. In the reflection, he was lying next to me on the bed, although in reality, there was nothing and no one in front of me. I froze, continuing to stare at the reflection. His reflection turned its face towards me. He looked at me predatorily, directly into my eyes, and silently moved his dry, gray tongue. The feeling of his presence was so real that I felt the hair on my neck stand up in fear. When I first saw this antique mirror at the street market, it caught my attention with its sinister magnetism. Its wooden frame was masterfully carved, covered with a web of cracks, as if it had absorbed the weight of centuries. The reflection was slightly foggy, creating a sense of depth, as if it held many secrets and foreign memories. The sun, hiding behind the clouds, barely illuminated the mirror, giving it an even more mysterious look. The seller, an old man with penetrating eyes, seemed overly eager to get rid of the mirror. His gaze was so piercing that it seemed as if he could see my thoughts. He didn't hesitate to offer me an incredibly low price. His voice was full of strange excitement, which I initially took as a simple desire for a good deal. "This mirror has its own story," he said, wiping his hands on his old jacket. His fingers trembled as if he was trying to hide his excitement. "It cost me a lot, but for such a bambina, I'll give it away almost for free." Something about his behavior should have alerted me. Maybe it was the slight shadow of fear in his eyes, or perhaps the way he hurried to close the deal. But I was enchanted by the mirror, its mystery and beauty. I have always loved antiques, so I saw a real treasure in this mirror. I touched the frame, and a chill ran through my fingers, as if the mirror was giving me a piece of its past energy. But I didn't pay attention to this feeling. I was too captivated by the thought of how it would look in my new apartment. I imagined how its charming, slightly worn beauty would add a special charm to the room. The seller hastily wrapped the mirror in an old cloth and even helped with free delivery to my new apartment, as if he wanted to get rid of it as quickly as possible. I, full of enthusiasm and inspired by its beauty, hurried home, not realizing what dark presence I had let into my life. The mirror was just the beginning of a nightmare I had yet to discover. My new apartment in Venice was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter in my life. Located on the first floor of an old building, it looked directly onto one of the picturesque canals. Huge windows, framed with delicate carvings, allowed sunlight to penetrate inside, creating a play of light and shadow on the walls. High ceilings with gilded stucco depicting scenes from mythology added grandeur to the room. On the floor lay antique rugs that I found at the same local market. Their patterns harmoniously matched the room's decor. That's why the mirror fit perfectly into the apartment's design. I placed it on the opposite side of the living room, near the windows. The mirror added the charm of an ancient era to the room, as if it held the stories of many generations. Its delicate carved frame and slightly foggy reflection attracted the attention of everyone who came to the housewarming party. But among all the guests, there was one recent acquaintance who looked at the mirror with distrust and fear. Her eyes, full of anxiety, avoided the reflection, as if she was afraid to see something that others did not notice. All evening, she tried to stay away from the mirror, her movements tense and anxious. When it was time to say goodbye, she quietly and gloomily warned me about the difficult fate that this mirror might carry. She advised me to be cautious, or better yet, to give it away or throw it out. I didn't pay much attention to this. Her words seemed nonsensical to me, and her fear exaggerated. I decided that she had just had one too many glasses of wine, and her imagination was running wild. But even then, I saw something in her eyes that made me linger on the mirror longer than usual. In the dark reflection, I briefly noticed a shadow that seemed to reach out its cold hands to me. My heart beat faster, but I quickly looked away, trying to convince myself that it was just a play of light or alcohol in my blood. However, her words still echoed in my head. Gradually, anxiety began to spread through my mind, quietly whispering that there really was something evil hidden in this mirror. But I decided to ignore these feelings, not realizing that this neglect on my part could lead to terrible consequences. That night, I slept very restlessly, but it was not surprising, as I had been sleeping poorly since the move. But that night, I fell into a deep sleep, although it seemed very real to me, even too real. I was standing on the edge of the canal, where everything around was shrouded in thick fog. The waters were dark and murky, whispering ominously on invisible waves. On the other side of the canal, through the fog, I could make out a shadowy figure. It exuded cold and danger. It seemed to me that someone was waiting for me, pulling me towards them with invisible threads of fear and anxiety. I felt that this meeting promised nothing good. My heart was pounding, and I tried to take a step back, but my feet seemed glued to the ground. I woke up, filled with unpleasant impressions. After this terrible dream, the feeling of anxiety did not go away, and I went to the kitchen to calm down with a cup of strong coffee. My hands were trembling as I poured the boiling water, and I tried to distract myself from thoughts of the dream, and therefore did not immediately notice that my feet were dirty, as if I had indeed gone outside to the canals. Maybe I had dirtied my feet somewhere at home. Unable to find peace, I froze in some kind of trance on the couch. Only when the sun rose higher did I return to the living room. At first, I didn't notice anything strange, but suddenly my attention was drawn to the mirror. Something had changed. Its frame, which had previously been simply antique and beautiful, now looked decayed, covered with a web of fine cracks that seemed to have appeared overnight. But what worried me the most was the reflection. It had become even more foggy, and it seemed that the fog from the dream was in its depths. The feeling of anxiety and uncertainty grew, but I decided that it was just the result of sleepless nights. I decided not to focus on it and tried to convince myself that everything was fine. Getting ready for work, I quickly drank my coffee, trying to suppress the strange feelings. Work absorbed me, and for a while, I forgot about the mirror and the disturbing dreams. But when evening came and I returned home, the feeling of something inevitable returned. The mirror, like a sinister guardian, stood in its place, silent and mysterious. The next night, the nightmare repeated, but this time everything was much more real. I was again standing on the edge of the canal, and around me spread a thick, ominous fog. The waters of the canal were dark and murky. Their surface seemed to boil with hidden forces. The shadowy figure on the opposite bank looked clearer. It was moving closer to me. Its face was still hidden in the darkness, but I felt its cold gaze piercing me like sharp, icy needles. The feeling of hopelessness and fear paralyzed me. I felt that this meeting promised nothing good. All my instincts screamed of danger, but my legs refused to move. The silhouette was getting closer and closer, and I could hear its heavy breathing, which sent chills down my spine. The presence was so palpable that I could swear it was not just a dream. I woke up screaming, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. This nightmare caused me real anxiety. Waking up in a cold sweat, I couldn't be sure if these dreams were just a product of my imagination, but I was sure that it was not just the result of sleepless nights. It was something much worse, something that was creeping from another world into my subconscious to terrorize me. Each night became more and more terrifying, and I didn't know how to stop this horrible nightmare that was consuming my life. The following days turned into a real nightmare. Every time I was in the apartment, I felt like I was being watched. I also started noticing strange things. At first, it was the muffled whispering I heard late at night. I attributed it to neighbors or people walking on the street, but when I went to bed, the whispering didn't stop. It seemed to follow me from room to room. Next, things began to change their location. First, The keys mysteriously ended up in the kitchen, then my hairbrush disappeared, and I found it the next day on the windowsill. I was ready to blame it on my muddled mind due to constant fatigue, if not for one incident. Getting ready for work, I was looking for my pass. I approached the mirror to fix my hair and saw the reflection of the pass on the bed, but when I turned around, I suddenly froze. There was nothing on the bed. Slowly turning back, I looked into the mirror and saw that the pass was still lying on the light blanket. My hands trembled, causing the hairbrush to fall from my grasp. Fear gripped me, paralyzing my body. I was afraid to take even a single breath, so I barely breathed. It felt like someone was standing behind me, although the reflection showed only me. I frantically scanned the room for something to defend myself with. From whom or what? Realizing the absurdity of the situation, I abruptly turned around and met emptiness. There was no one behind me, and the pass was in its place. Exhaling with relief, I quickly grabbed it and practically ran to the exit, thinking someone might chase after me. At night, it continued. Again, nightmares. Only now it felt like I was surrounded by people. I felt hundreds of touches on me, making me feel dirty and exhausted. One of these touches seemed to bring me to my senses, and I woke up abruptly. Calming down a bit, I wanted to turn on the light when I suddenly heard footsteps. This made me freeze and literally wrap myself in the blanket. Cold, piercing fear gripped my soul from within, making me tremble. I didn't know what to do next, and who it was. Maybe burglars had broken into the apartment. I wanted them to take everything they wanted, just not to touch me. I was afraid to even reach for the phone on the nightstand, but I needed to do it to call the police. The footsteps stopped right next to my bed. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound, but fear completely consumed me. I waited, expecting to feel a touch on my skin, to hear someone's raspy breath near my ear, but there was only silence. Only my own terrified thoughts filled this ominous space. I listened, trying to catch the slightest sound, but there was nothing but silence. It wasn't ordinary silence, but one that presses on your ears, oppresses, and makes your body shudder with fear. My hands trembled, clutching the pillow, and I felt tears streaming down my cheeks, soaking the fabric. How much time had passed? Minutes or maybe hours? I didn't know how long this nightmarish waiting lasted, but it felt like eternity had frozen in that moment. Then, unexpectedly, I heard the footsteps begin to recede. Slowly, one by one, they filled the room again. Their sound was quiet, but each step echoed in my mind. Finally, when I could no longer bear this horrible state of uncertainty, I dared to peek out from under the blanket. Slowly lifting its edge, I cautiously looked around the room. My heart was ready to stop from fear, but there was no one. The room was empty. Only the moonlight penetrated through the curtains, casting dim reflections on the floor. Suddenly, my heart froze in my chest. I noticed something strange in the mirror's reflection. In the semi-darkness of the room, it looked unusual, as if the reflection in it was foggy, almost motionless. I quickly turned on the light, and the room filled with bright, artificial light, instantly dispelling the shadows. Trembling with excitement, I got out of bed, and barely standing on my feet, slowly approached the mirror. What I saw made me freeze in place. The mirror was not as usual. It didn't reflect the room clearly as before, but seemed shrouded in fog, pulsating inside like a living creature. My own features, reflected in it, were blurred and ghostly, like part of another world. But that wasn't the worst part. On the surface of the mirror, as if emerging from the fog, appeared a clear, wet handprint. It looked fresh, as if someone had just pressed their hand against the glass. I felt cold sweat trickle down my back. The print was slightly blurred, but the wet sheen on it left no doubt. It couldn't be a figment of my imagination. I felt the panic rising. My fingers trembled as I slowly touched the mirror. The cold surface under my fingers was real, but the handprint wouldn't disappear, as if it was part of that foggy world inside the mirror. Was it the person who entered my room that left this mark? Or perhaps it was the mark of someone who lives in this mirror, someone who watches me from the other side. I spent the rest of the night sleepless, curled up on the bed and not taking my eyes off the mirror. My thoughts were jumbled, but waves of fear kept me from relaxing for even a moment. I could no longer trust sleep, fearing what might happen while I was in that vulnerable state. My body trembled with tension, and every creak of the floor or gust of wind outside the window made my heart stop. I tried to understand what was really happening. Thousands of thoughts swirled in my head, but none provided a logical explanation. My gaze kept returning to the mirror, which now seemed to me like a window into another world, a world that shouldn't have penetrated my home. I felt that this mirror was the cause of everything that had been happening to me lately, but what to do? And then I remembered him, the man from whom I bought this mirror. The memory of him stirred mixed feelings in me. I connected to this image everything I now knew: his nervousness, the haste with which he tried to get rid of the mirror, and that strange look he gave me as I left with it. He knew something I didn't. I focused on this thought, and suddenly a decision began to form within me. I had to find this man, demand answers from him. He must explain what this mirror is and why it is so cursed. I had to return it as quickly as possible before something irreversible happened. My paranoia turned into determination, and I decided, in the morning, I would go in search of this man, even if I had to turn the whole city upside down to find him. However, the search proved futile. With the first rays of the sun, I went to the same market where I bought the mirror. Every step, every familiar corner of Venice seemed soaked in despair, but I didn't stop. I walked through all the rows, looking into the faces of the sellers, trying to find the man whose image was in my mind, but he was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I approached every vendor, everyone who might know something, but their answers were the same. They didn't know who I was talking about. Their eyes showed genuine confusion, and none of them even remembered a mirror like mine being sold at that market. It seemed incredible, as I clearly remembered where I bought it. With each passing minute, with each futile question, my fear grew. What did all this mean? Had I imagined this man, or perhaps he was some phantom? Being that appeared only to pass this cursed mirror to me, my determination began to turn into despair, and the feeling that I was trapped grew stronger. Now I was sure this mirror should never have come into my life, but it was here, and it seemed there was nothing I could do to get rid of it. When I returned home, I was met with a new disaster. The floor of the apartment was covered with water, which seemed to have flooded the apartment, as if someone had left a tap open or a pipe had burst somewhere. However, all the taps were closed and the pipes were intact. Panic gripped me again. I hurried to check the attic, but there were no signs of water there either. To calm down and find some explanation, I went upstairs to the neighbors. Maybe they had accidentally flooded me. They greeted me with distrust and a bit of anger. The neighbors said everything was dry in their place and there had been no water at all. However, their words made me freeze. They scolded me for the loud footsteps and noise they heard from my apartment at night. They insisted that I keep quiet at night. I just nodded pale, unable to find words. Returning to my place, I saw that the water that had just covered the floor had disappeared without a trace, as if it had never been there. The floor was completely dry, without the slightest hint of moisture. My hands trembled and my heart pounded in my chest. Something was happening in this apartment, and it had a direct connection to the mirror. It became clear to me that I was trapped, and getting out of it would not be easy. I decided that the only person who could help me understand what was happening was that new acquaintance, Sophie, who had warned me about the mirror at the housewarming party. Finding her number, I dialed it, trying to calm my trembling hands. When she answered, I began to persuade her to meet with me. At first, she refused, saying she was busy and that it all looked like the result of overwork. But hearing the alarm and panic in my voice, she eventually agreed to come. When she entered my apartment, I was sitting on the couch, hugging myself, as if trying to protect myself from an invisible enemy. But as soon as I saw her, I immediately got up, as if grasping the last hope for salvation. I began to lead her to the bedroom, wanting to show her the mirror, but my acquaintance categorically refused to approach it. Her refusal was so resolute that a new wave of fear engulfed me. I told her everything that had happened, about the strange water on the floor, the night footsteps, and the terrible handprint on the mirror. She listened attentively, occasionally nodding, but her face became more and more concerned. After I finished, she said that I should get rid of this mirror, and the sooner, the better. We talked a bit more, and she began to gather her things to leave. As she headed towards the exit, she suddenly stopped by the bedroom door and involuntarily glanced at the mirror. Something in its reflection made her pale and freeze in place. I didn't know what she saw, but her face turned deathly white and her eyes widened in horror. Without saying a word, she abruptly turned and almost ran out of the apartment, as if fleeing from some invisible horror lurking in the mirror. I stood there, trying to understand what she had seen and why her fear was so intense, but the answer never came, leaving me trapped in terror and hopelessness. Her reaction frightened me even more. Her sudden panic, the terror I saw in her eyes, plunged me into an abyss of fear and confusion. At first, I thought about simply running away, spending the night at a friend's place, or booking a hotel room, just to avoid being alone with this cursed mirror. But then I gathered my thoughts. Running from problems is not my way. I decided that I needed to find a solution, not hide from fear. The first thing that came to mind was to cover the mirror. I took a sheet and threw it over the mirror, hiding it from view. Now it could no longer scare me with its sinister reflection. Next, I did everything possible to fill the silence in the apartment. I turned on some music to play softly in the background, so there wouldn't be even a hint of silence that could let my imagination run wild again. Then I turned on the TV to add more noise and distract myself with something light and mundane. To calm my nerves, I decided to have a little wine. The first sip brought a gentle warmth, relaxing my tense muscles. I began to feel the anxieties slowly recede. My thoughts became less chaotic, and for the first time in days, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was almost a feeling of control over the situation, as if I had managed, even temporarily, to drive away the fear that was clouding my mind. In a relaxed state, under the influence of wine and fatigue from sleepless nights, I didn't notice when I started to fall asleep. A warm relaxation enveloped my body, and I felt myself drifting into a sweet slumber. At first, the sleep was light and soothing, but gradually, something began to change. Suddenly, I was back on the bridge spanning the canal. The whole world around me was ominously shrouded in fog, which tightly embraced every stone, every shadow, every sound. The water in the canal became even darker, seeming to absorb even the faint light that pierced through the fog. And then I saw him, a tall male figure, hidden in the fog, stood nearby. But this time he was not alone. Next to him stood another silhouette, short, delicate, resembling a woman. I tried to make out their faces, but the fog stubbornly hid them from my view. Suddenly, screams pierced the silence, stabbing at my heart. Then came the splashing of water. I rushed towards the silhouettes, trying to reach them, but every step seemed to bring me no closer. They remained at the same distance, unmoving and unreachable. With horror, I saw the male figure begin to submerge the delicate silhouette into the water. The water swallowed the body. The splashing grew fainter until it ceased altogether, and at the moment when the last traces of the body disappeared beneath the surface, the male figure sharply turned towards me. It became clear to me he had noticed me. I froze in place, trying to understand where I knew the sound of those approaching footsteps from. They were familiar but unbearably terrifying. And suddenly, I woke up. My heart was pounding, and waves of panic washed over me. And then I realized those footsteps were not just part of my dream. They were real, and I could hear them moving away from my bed again. My heart began to race wildly when I heard those terrifying footsteps again. They were so real, so clear, and seemed to be getting closer. I held my breath, all my attention focused on that dreadful sound echoing through the night silence. The footsteps seemed to dance on the edge of my mind, sending waves of fear coursing through my body. But suddenly they stopped, leaving me in oppressive silence. Unable to bear the tension, I abruptly turned on the light and first looked at the mirror. The sheet that was supposed to cover the mirror now lay on the floor. I froze, horror engulfing my entire being, as I saw the mirror becoming clearer. The fog that had previously clouded its surface seemed to dissipate, revealing a reflection that was too real to be just a play of light. This couldn't be a coincidence, but in an attempt to calm myself, I attributed it to the sheet slipping off accidentally, perhaps due to a draft or my tossing and turning in my sleep. I got out of bed, my heart still pounding anxiously, and covered the mirror with the sheet again. This time, I left nothing to chance. I taped the fabric securely on all sides, but even that didn't give me a sense of safety. I hurried to the kitchen, where I grabbed a kitchen knife. With it, I felt a bit more confident, but fear still held me in its grip. I spent the rest of the night on the couch holding the knife in my hand, listening intently to every sound, ready to defend myself. Sleep was distant and unreachable, but I knew one thing. With the arrival of morning, I was no longer going to run away. In the morning, I woke up with a heavy feeling in my heart. My thoughts were filled with fear and anxiety that had haunted me all night. The cursed mirror. I knew it was the source of all my terror, and I had to find a way to get rid of it. But how? This question tormented me. Sitting at my computer, I hastily searched for any information that could help. I read several articles about cursed objects, antique mirrors, but none of them provided a concrete solution applicable to my case. Fear began to rise in me again, the feeling of hopelessness gradually washing over me, threatening to engulf my mind. The only thing left for me was to physically get rid of the mirror. The very thought of it scared me, but I understood that there was no other way. I approached the mirror, trying to calm myself. My breathing quickened, my heart pounded wildly. I grabbed the frame, tried to lift the mirror, but it didn't budge. It was as if it was rooted to the floor, anchored in reality itself. Thoughts swirled in my head. Was I really that weak? Or was it something more, something sinister that wouldn't let me move this cursed object? My hands trembled, and I felt panic rising. In desperation, I called a delivery service, hoping that a few strong men would help me solve this problem. At first, they agreed to come, and I sighed with relief. But after a while, they called back and said they couldn't come due to unforeseen circumstances. My calm began to crumble like sand slipping through my fingers. With each subsequent call, hope became more and more elusive. I called friends, but everyone who initially agreed to help eventually backed out, finding new excuses. It was as if they sensed something wrong, something that made them avoid me and this mirror. The last refusals came at the very last minute, leaving me alone with my fear. And so I stood in the middle of the room, blaming myself for bringing this mirror into my home. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this mirror was not just an antique item. It held some sinister power, something that defied logic. My fear turned into sheer terror when I realized that this mirror might have chosen me, and now I had no idea how to escape its grasp. I felt I was out of options when all my attempts to get rid of the mirror failed. It was unbearable to know that danger lurked in my own home, but be unable to do anything to protect myself. At that moment, I realized I needed professional help, people who understood such things. Maybe among them, there would be someone who could explain what this mirror was and how to get rid of it. First, I turned to antique restorers. They had seen many old things, knew how to work with items that bore the mark of time. They could at least assess the condition of the mirror or suggest how to safely dispose of it. The first specialist arrived with a large toolbox. He examined the mirror's frame, trying to be professional, but I noticed how he began nervously biting his lips when he touched the wooden surface. His hands, accustomed to working with fine details, suddenly trembled. He looked up at the reflection, and I saw fear widen his pupils. Within seconds, he stepped back, gathering his tools so quickly it was as if the workday had ended, though he had just begun. "I'm sorry, but I can't work with this mirror," he said, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. "I need to go." I tried to ask what had scared him, but he just fled, nearly knocking me over. There was something in his eyes that I would never forget, as if he had seen something that shouldn't exist. After this incident, my fear only intensified. I needed more radical help. I found contacts of a medium who specialized in such cases. Maybe he knew what was hiding in the mirror and how to combat it. One of them, a grim man with gray hair and a piercing gaze, came to my home late in the evening. He entered the room confidently, but as soon as he approached the mirror, I noticed his face begin to pale. He started muttering something under his breath, as if trying to invoke some protective spell, but then abruptly fell silent, freezing in place. This is bad, very bad," he murmured, not taking his eyes off the mirror. His hands trembled, and he almost immediately stepped back, looking at me with horror in his eyes. "You shouldn't deal with this. I don't know what it is, but it's dangerous. Leave it, and don't come back here." He hurried to the door, not even waiting for me to ask what he had seen. "What is it? What did you see?" I shouted after him, but he had already disappeared through the door, leaving me alone with my fears. Now I was completely alone. My attempt to find help had only made the situation even scarier. They all fled from the mirror, as if from something invisible but extremely dangerous. Something was inside this mirror, something that instilled such fear in people that they refused to deal with it. After the last guest left my apartment, I was enveloped in oppressive loneliness. Despair gradually filled my thoughts, echoing with every step that sounded in the empty rooms. I went to bed, not expecting peace, but surprisingly, the night passed quietly, plunging me into a deep, serene sleep, as if the evil itself had decided to take a break. It was so unusual that, waking up in the morning, I felt a slight anxious breath on the back of my neck, as if the night's silence was just a prelude to something greater. My unease was shattered by a loud, insistent knock at the door. Not fully awake, I got up, dragging my feet, as if all my strength had left me overnight, but sleep instantly fled when I saw two police officers at the door. Their serious faces foretold unpleasant news. Anxiety gripped me, reflected in my trembling fingers as I invited them in. They began asking questions about Sophie, our friendship, our recent meetings, and whether I had noticed anything strange in her behavior. With each question, a sense of impending doom grew within me, as if something invisible was pulling me into an abyss from which there was no escape. Suddenly, one of the officers said what I had feared. Sophie had been found dead, drowned in one of the canals. My blood ran cold. It was like a blow to the chest. Memories of the dreams suddenly flashed in my mind. The male silhouette, the water, the ominous splashing. The whole world around me seemed to shift, turning into a murky, dark reality where nothing made sense anymore. As the police were about to leave, one of them handed me a letter. He explained that they found me at this address because of the letter, and although he wasn't supposed to do this, there might be something important for me inside. Anxiety gripped my heart in a steel vice as I took the letter. It was fragile paper, trembling in my hand like something alive, full of secrets and danger. I couldn't take my eyes off it, feeling that with each passing moment, something terrible and inevitable was approaching. And now I understood. None of them would help. They all knew more than they wanted to say. And now I had only one option left: to find a way to confront this dark force that had entered my life through this cursed mirror. I sat on the couch, holding the letter in my hands, feeling my heart pounding wildly in my chest. Fear and a sense of impending doom gripped me tightly. A letter from Sophie. I couldn't believe it was here, in my hands, after everything that had happened. As I opened the envelope, I felt tears welling up, but I held them back, trying to keep myself together. Sophie's words were filled with anxiety and despair. She wrote that she had been trying to find a way to help me, desperately searching for answers. She had come across some old records, descriptions of similar cases. The letter said that the mirror I had brought into my life was not just an antique item. It was like a parasite, absorbing all my strength, feeding on my emotions, gradually draining me and driving me insane. Sophie warned that this process had only just begun, and that with each passing day, the mirror would grow stronger until it consumed me completely. She urgently advised me to leave the apartment immediately, before it was too late. My body trembled with fear. Each of Sophie's words, like bitter poisonous juice, seeped into my consciousness, making my heart contract with horror. I knew she was right. I felt the mirror consuming me, turning my life into a nightmare. But at the same time, I couldn't reconcile myself to the thought of running away. I placed the letter on the table, stood up resolutely, feeling a wave of fear and anger rising within me. I approached the mirror, which still stood in the bedroom, dark and sinister, like a silent observer of my suffering. The sheet I had covered it with earlier was once again dislodged, as it had been many times before. With trembling hands, I grabbed the fabric, tied it tightly again, as if this could contain the dark forces within. I knew Sophie was right, that staying here was dangerous, but I couldn't just give up. I had spent so much effort and money to bring my dream to life, and now I had to abandon everything because of this cursed mirror. The thought made my chest boil with anger. I wasn't going to back down. This mirror would not ruin my life. I spent the rest of the day outside the apartment, trying to find at least temporary peace from the horror that had engulfed me. The sunlight seemed safe, but even it couldn't fully dispel the sorrow that had settled in my soul after the news of Sophie's death. Her death. That heavy word wouldn't leave my mind. With each passing minute, the burden of loss became unbearable. Guilt and despair mixed, tearing me apart from within. I couldn't shake the thought that if it weren't for this cursed mirror, she would still be alive. Troubling questions swirled in my head. Did this happen because of me? Because of this sinister mirror? Fear and sadness, mixed with guilt, turned every thought into a sharp thorn that pierced my heart. When I returned home, the sense of safety vanished the moment I crossed the threshold. Paranoia set in immediately, compelling me to scan the apartment for any sign of someone or something's presence. But everything was in its place. Nothing had changed, yet the feeling of something dark and unseen lingered, as if the apartment breathed this darkness, ready to engulf me at any moment. I tried to suppress this paranoia by taking a sedative, perhaps even more than I should have. The fog that enveloped my consciousness seemed the only way to temporarily mute this endless horror. I sank onto the bed, hoping to rest for at least a few hours, but deep down, I knew this rest would be nothing but an illusion. As the sedative began to take effect, I felt myself sinking into an almost artificial calm, but the tension and fear still hovered at the edge of my consciousness, ready to break through at the slightest provocation. I tried to convince myself that this night would be different. My mind was clouded by the sedatives, and I felt a strange calm that wasn't entirely natural. It seemed that this night might finally be peaceful, without nightmares and the curse of the mirror. But sleep brought with it what I feared most. I was once again by the canal, where thick fog swirled, swallowing everything around. The air was damp and cold, as if the very place was trying to push me away. I felt something tighten inside me, a premonition that everything was going wrong again, but I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed by this strange place that once again ensnared me in its trap. Suddenly, I felt pressure. Cold, icy hands gripped my shoulders, and I realized I was not alone. They were strong, as if made of iron, and their touch pierced me to the bone. I tried to break free, but every movement seemed futile. The cold spread throughout my body, and I felt myself being slowly submerged into icy water. The water enveloped me, and the cold penetrated inside, squeezing my lungs, making me gasp for air. I struggled frantically, trying to escape this nightmare, but my strength failed me. The water filled my mouth and nostrils, and I felt it begin to pull me down, swallowing everything around. The cold hands pressed harder, and I felt I was about to disappear into this abyss. But suddenly, I woke up. I was gasping for air, as if I had just surfaced from the water. My body trembled with fear, and each breath was heavy, as if I had just escaped death. But the horror was not only in this. I felt the cold hands slowly release me, leaving invisible marks behind. I sat on the bed, soaked, and my bed was also wet, as if the water from the nightmare was real. This was the last straw. My strength was exhausted. Fear filled my entire being. I howled. Fear and despair mingled in this scream, echoing through the empty walls of the apartment. I couldn't take it anymore. This mirror was driving me insane, and I realized I had to act. I jumped out of bed, turned on the lights in all the rooms, as if this could drive away the darkness trying to engulf me. Then I started looking for a hammer. The feeling of cold didn't leave me, but now it was not only physical cold, it was fear that penetrated every cell of my body, making me move quickly, faster than ever before. I could no longer allow this mirror to control my life. I finally found the hammer, gripping it so tightly that my fingers turned white. It seemed like the only thing that could save me, though deep down, I knew it was futile. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something in the window's reflection. It was the same fog I had seen in my nightmare, but now it appeared here, in my home. Cold terror ran through my body, and I clutched the hammer to my chest, as if it could protect me from what was coming. The fog thickened, enveloping the reflection, and then a male figure began to emerge from it. He was the same as in my dreams, and with each of his steps becoming clearer, my fear only intensified. I couldn't take it anymore. An inner scream of panic made me dash to the bedroom where the mirror stood, but what I saw there was even more terrifying. In every mirrored surface, in every reflection, was the same figure. It was approaching me from all sides, as if trying to surround me. My fear turned into despair, and I began smashing everything glass around. Mirrors, windows, any surface that could reflect this silhouette. I screamed, begging for it to leave me alone, but it seemed the more I fought, the closer it got. Fear completely took over my mind. I could no longer think rationally, only act under the influence of panic. Each hammer blow was filled with desperation. Each shard of glass only intensified the feeling of impending doom. Finally, only one mirror remained, the one that was the source of all my troubles. I raised the hammer and struck it with all my might. A strange, ghostly sound echoed, as if I had hit wet sand. The mirror didn't shatter. It was oddly resilient, as if mocking me, refusing to break. I struck again and again, but to no avail. With each blow, I felt my strength leaving me, my hope evaporating with each strike. Unable to bear it any longer, I fell to my knees before the mirror, exhausted and broken. I covered my face with my hands and wept bitterly. It wasn't just crying, it was a soul-wrenching scream of fear, pain, and hopelessness. I was defeated, shattered, and the shadow that had been haunting me now seemed inevitable. I didn't know how long I sat there, broken and empty, amidst the half-destroyed apartment. Time lost its meaning. The sense of reality gradually faded, like fog dissolving at dawn. My consciousness felt alien, detached from my body, as if I were observing everything from the outside. The silence was deafening, and I hid in my thoughts, to avoid what had just happened. It seemed to me that someone was knocking on the door, calling me insistently, but these sounds were so distant, as if they were coming from another world where I no longer existed. I ignored them because they couldn't break through the wall that separated me from reality. In my hand was a shard of a small mirror I had broken earlier. I brought it up to my face, and it was the only movement I could manage. The shard was sharp, and although it cut my skin, I felt no pain. Crimson, thick blood trickled down my fingers, drop by drop falling to the floor, staining the new carpet, but it didn't matter to me. I looked into the shard, hoping to find something that could explain this horror, but all I saw was emptiness, a void that consumed me from within. Or maybe it was my reflection, tired, exhausted, as if all my life force had been drained, leaving only a shell. At that moment, when I had completely lost touch with reality, my neighbors and the police found me. They burst into the apartment, forcing the door open, and saw me on my knees, staring entranced at the shard of the mirror amidst the half-ruined room. My consciousness slowly returned to reality, but the fear and horror that gripped me wouldn't let me escape this nightmare. They tried to bring me to my senses. The people around me were persistent, but I didn't want to return. I understood they were trying, but I couldn't make myself feel their words or actions. The horror that surrounded me had rooted so deeply that any attempt to break back into reality seemed pointless. The danger hanging in the air made me hide in the darkest corners of my mind, where there was no place for fear or pain. When they sat me on the couch, trying to talk to me, shaking my shoulders, I just stared at them emotionlessly. There was no understanding, no fear, no hope in my eyes. I looked at the people gathered around, seeing them as if they were ghosts, having nothing to do with me. The neighbors, realizing something was seriously wrong with me, called an ambulance. The doctors arrived quickly, examined me, and determined that my condition was unstable. A result of shock, they decided to take me to the hospital. I understood what was happening, but I no longer had the strength to fight or explain anything. I didn't care anymore. I just silently followed them, like a puppet moved by invisible strings. Before leaving the apartment, I paused for a moment and looked at the mirror. It gleamed as if new, just like the day I bought it, as if nothing had happened, as if this whole horrific nightmare was just a play of light on its smooth surface. But I knew the truth. Sophie was right. The mirror had fulfilled its mission. It had taken everything I had and left me with an emptiness that would now forever be a part of me. After a few days in the hospital, I began to return to reality. At first, everything around seemed distant, as if through a thick fog, but gradually, like after a long sleep, my thoughts became clearer and my senses sharper. The doctors and nurses watched me closely, their eyes constantly trying to catch signs of my improvement. Slowly but surely, I began to rebuild myself from the fragments. One morning, I finally managed to speak a few words. At first, it was difficult. Each word felt almost foreign, but with each passing day, I spoke more, trying to regain a sense of normalcy. The doctors concluded that my condition was caused by the stress of Sophie's death. They assured me that it was a typical reaction to trauma and that it would pass with time. I nodded silently, agreeing with their conclusions, though deep down I knew it wasn't just that. I was afraid to tell the truth about the mirror, fearing they wouldn't understand and would send me to a psychiatric hospital from which there would be no return. So I kept quiet, took the prescribed medication, and agreed to sessions with a psychologist, doing everything to appear sane. With each passing day, I felt a little better, though the pain and fear continued to sit deep inside. My friends began to visit me, but I carefully avoided any conversations about what had happened. Their support was important, but I couldn't let them know the truth. My smile was forced, my words cautious, but no one noticed, and that suited me. The day of my discharge was approaching, and I knew it was time to take the next step. I gathered my strength and wrote to my friends, saying I needed help with repairing the apartment. I needed to restore everything that had been destroyed that terrible night. I hoped that physical labor would help me gather my thoughts and find the strength to start life anew. My friends immediately agreed to help without asking unnecessary questions. It seemed that everything was getting better, but deep down, I knew I had to overcome my main fear. The mirror, though silent, was still there in my apartment, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for its moment. When I returned to the apartment, almost everything was ready. My friends had done their best, and I felt grateful, though I couldn't fully share their satisfaction. At my request, they found a large cover and completely covered the mirror, as I couldn't even look at it. The very fact of its presence caused a wave of panic in me. But now that it was hidden, I began to calm down a bit. After a bit of cleaning and celebrating my return, I started to see the guests off. Everyone was happy that I had returned to normal life, and it should have pleased me, but instead, I felt only inner tension. Something was bothering me, as if something inevitable was about to happen. I noticed one of my colleagues looking curiously at the cover hiding the mirror. I wanted to say something, to warn him, to distract him, but seeing his fascinated gaze, I froze. The words stuck in my throat, and I couldn't utter a sound, just silently watched as he approached. He slowly uncovered the mirror, and I saw his face change. There was something more than just interest. It was genuine admiration. He reverently examined the intricate details of the frame, as if seeing such craftsmanship for the first time. And suddenly, the mirror wobbled. This struck me to the core, as I hadn't been able to move it no matter how hard I tried. At that moment, I realized it was a sign. The mirror no longer needed me. It had found a new victim, a new object for its dark power. This realization brought a strange sense of relief mixed with deep fear. I approached the guy, trying to gather my thoughts. He enthusiastically expressed his admiration for the detailed and delicate work of the frame, marveling at how majestic the mirror seemed, and then, not missing the moment, I offered to sell it to him. The proposal was so absurd that in another situation, I would have laughed at it myself, but now it didn't matter. The only important thing was to get rid of this cursed mirror at any cost. He was surprised, but the idea of a successful purchase of such an antique quickly overshadowed all his doubts. He agreed without hesitation, and we settled on a price so low that even I felt like a market vendor. But I didn't stop, didn't allow myself to feel guilty. The main thing was to get rid of the mirror, to pass this burden to someone else. And it seemed I succeeded. After my colleague took the mirror, an unusual silence settled in the apartment. I sat on the couch, feeling relieved, but it was a temporary feeling. The peace that followed was more like the calm before the storm. I knew I had gotten rid of the mirror, but the fear didn't disappear. It remained, as if it had left its shadow inside me. The next day I spent in a daze, trying to return to normal life, but nothing helped. Every time I passed the place where the mirror had stood, I felt a sense of emptiness, as if a part of me had stayed there. The tension in the apartment was so thick that I could barely breathe. That evening, after returning from work, I felt I could no longer stay there. The apartment I once loved had become a prison for me. I took a few things and left, leaving the keys on the table. I could no longer live there, but I didn't know where I was going. The city that had once been my home now seemed foreign and hostile. Wandering the streets, I realized I had nowhere to go. I was tired and exhausted, so I sat on a bench in the park. The night was dark and cold, the wind carrying the sense of autumn, and I felt the cold penetrate my clothes, chilling me to the bone. Suddenly I saw my reflection in the window of a nearby house. It was just a moment, but I clearly saw something strange, unnatural in it. This vision filled me with wild fear, and I realized I could never escape. It wasn't the mirror that was the cause of everything that had happened. Something much darker, something inside me. Returning home, I felt that the apartment was no longer mine. I was no longer the master of my own life. Since then, every evening I noticed something strange in my reflection, in glass, in water, even in shadows. Something that lived inside me, watching my every step, reminding me that I would never be free. I sat on the floor in the middle of the apartment, feeling the darkness envelop me, cold hands squeezing my heart again. Since then, I stopped looking in mirrors, but it didn't matter. The reflection always found me, reminding me that I could never escape what now lived inside. And in this darkness, I dissolved, forever remaining a prisoner of my own fears. Now, let me share a moment from my life. I am an artist, and oil painting is both exciting and relaxing for me. About 8 years ago, I became so passionate about oil painting that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day, I looked back and realized what knowledge I needed when I first started. So I prepared an intensive course of 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or unnecessary chatter, just rich content that is immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of 1 day of car rental. Art therapy is a great way to cope with your anxieties. Link in profile or description.